Thank you. Suma and I must compete with coffee in the task of keeping you awake. We'll try our best to keep it short. I want to go back to the very first slide that Marian started off with, the one which had the trajectory of various countries in terms of GDP growth rates in the post-crisis period. And when you see a picture with different lines at different heights, one thing that it naturally your mind instinctively is drawn towards the fact that this is some kind of a competitive environment. Why are they growing so fast? And why is this bit not growing as fast? And my approach is to ask ourselves whether, rather than thinking of this in competitive terms, in rivalrous terms, we think of the possibility that there may be more global cooperation. And now you could think of this global cooperation in terms of some kind of a core and a periphery. Slavos talk, etc., again, was talking about different parts of Europe. There was talk of core and periphery earlier. And there was also the idea that you could think of core periphery within a region or within a sub-region, but I'm thinking of this in a global scale. So at one end you might think of India and China, where Suma and I have done some work about their technological efforts, and let's say the developed West, which we could call the core. This also draws into the point that you were making about when we talk about movements of technology across frontiers, etc. Whose technology is it? If it was produced in one country, when Tatas are producing something, are setting up a research lab in the UK, or Microsoft sets up something. So it's really talking about global capital and technology flows. The point that we want to make is that this kind of global interdependence can be somehow leveraged to produce an outcome which is going to be better in all sorts of terms, but one of the terms, in keeping with the green paper, is can it help somehow boost demand in order to solve the problem of recession or recovery from the recession. And we are going to rely on our previous work on multinationals to provide some examples that will illustrate the central point we want to make. Stepping back, you can always start thinking about what are the origins of the current recession. Lots of books have been written on it, lots of literature. We are not going to go deep into that, except I think I can't resist the temptation of, we have spent the day talking about the big names have been mentioned. Keynes is there, Schumpeter is there. I don't have a picture, but it would be terrible to have a day on innovation, technology, growth without mentioning the ghost of Marx. Okay. So in some senses, you could argue that the origins of the crisis which followed the financial crisis have something to do with collapse of demand. And that collapse of demand may itself have to do something with growing inequality that emerged in the last 40 to 50 years. And once again, there might be many dimensions and causes to that, for that inequality, but I want to draw upon something that happened and which is relevant to this discussion about public versus private investment in innovation. If you think about it, in many cases, we think of examples in which all the cost of innovation was borne in the public sector, and some of the rents to that, some of the returns to that, some of the benefits of that were captured through by private entities. Think of, when we talk about the internet, you can think about DARPA and CERN, as Ron mentioned, about them setting up the backbone and creating the infrastructure, but on top of that you have Google, large, valuable private firms having taken advantage of that. Occasionally you can get around this problem. One way of getting around this problem was lots of financial innovation. When demand was collapsing or at risk of collapsing, all sorts of financial innovation managed to prop up this demand for a while. But that's actually a salutary reminder. We have been talking about the entire day as if innovation is a good thing. If you look at all the innovation that happened in the financial sector, some of it might have been good, but a lot of it was bad. So you have to be careful about that. And of course, whether it was good or bad, it doesn't matter. Eventually, it was unable to sustain that level of demand, so that there is a question of going back to the green paper, what can be done, how do we get out of it? We take no position on public versus private investment. I have no quarrels with either, and if you tell me one brings in more of the other, even better. What I want to draw on is that if you look at private innovation and what are the incentives to private innovation, in many cases you can identify a range of technologies or a range of innovations where it makes sense to target this innovation to the needs of the very rich in order to maximize the value. And profit maximizing firms held by shareholders must do whatever maximizes that value. So it may make sense to produce a drug which serves the needs of some very rich people, and if the underlying economy has a tendency towards inequality, you should expect innovation to follow that. Our approach is to somehow see if there is some advantage in policy or structures flowing against that. I suppose the only reason for having co-authors and collaborators is to have someone to disagree with. And these occasions give you a chance to make your things more public, your disagreements public. I genuinely believe that the system of intellectual property rights protection, which typically gives unrestricted rights to those people who come up with innovations, has a certain flaw. And that flaw is that it might damage those who own those patent rights themselves. They often go after very small markets trying to maximize value from that when they could benefit. And one way might be to say, think of arrangements which could put some kinds of restrictions on the use of these of intellectual property, including, for instance, imposing conditions that you must share technologies on some basis, not give them away. You can be forced to license technologies, say by requirements that say you must put your technology into a patent pool, so that you will get a percentage of the sales of those people who deploy these technologies and employ them. My sense is that if this allows for more widespread use of those technologies, the returns from those technologies could be high for everyone. And then going back to that central question, if you're talking about, if your sole purpose is to answer to the problem of deficit in demand, if you're trying to prop up demand, yes, perhaps these technologies can boost demand, perhaps they will not. But they may serve a larger purpose too. The point that Keynes made that you can pay people to dig up holes and fill them up, I'd like to think about that as a simple strategy, but also then speculate on which holes to fill up. And this is not a question of which technologies to pick, which are the best technologies. It's really a question of trying to figure out where the global returns are going to be the highest in some other metric. And for that, I'm going to ask Suma to take over.
Okay. So as Sandeep said, and I will restate the position to reflect, my take on this is we are singing from the same hymn sheet, perhaps not at the same scale, is that if you see the origin of the crisis as resting in a problem of effective demand, then the solution must lie in lifting that demand. And we alluded to a structure of consumption that was very skewed. And so naturally, the examples we have chosen are also those that help to solve the problem of that structure of consumption. So the first example I'm going to take is actually a kind of supranational organizational innovation. And it is scaling up of commercialization the medical patent pools for HIV retrovirals. So for a very long time, the high cost of HIV retrovirals was a barrier to the treatment of AIDS in many countries, especially a big problem in poor countries like India and Africa. And whilst generic equivalents were being produced by firms like Cipla at a fraction of the price charged by the big pharmaceuticals, there was a lot of resistance to allowing this to happen. At the same time, it was clear that the larger volume of people who would benefit from these drugs actually were in poorer countries. And so the UN came up with this institutional innovation which drew upon the very positive experience of patent pools in telecommunications and other sectors where firms had voluntarily put together patents in order to facilitate cross-licensing. And it created the medical patent pool for HIV. And the great innovation here was that it used existing business models, added additional revenue streams. At the same time, it allowed manufacturers who had better catalysts which would enable these medicines to be produced at a larger scale to come into the market, license this technology, and make the price of production even cheaper. So in this way, they shifted the demand curve for this drug outwards. I mean, I should not use these words because I'm a lapsed economist, but speaking together with the bona fide one, I'm a bit confident. So we shifted the curve, okay? So they shifted the curve, and this was and there's, I think, a lot of scope to expand this into other areas of health. So I took this example of AIDS and HIV because something I was familiar with at the time when I was reading about it. It seemed a very clever way to do it. But of course, today when we are confronted with this big budgetary crisis in the NHS, we can see that some of this might help people, people in England too, and it would go some way towards alleviating the cost of social care for elderly and other people. So what I'm trying to say is that this need not be only about the north versus the south. You can have other applications of the same solution, but what is common to those solutions is changing the organizational distribution of the gains from technology. The second solution is leveraging alliance to move down the demand curve. So instead, you think of the previous example of shifting the demand curve outward, but you could also think about innovative ways where you could use production capabilities in southern countries, in countries like India and China, to access products of technologies much more cheaply. So this is a complementarity which exists, which has been noticed by firms definitely. Look at the number of plants that are being located in China. But I think it could be, we think it could be exploited more. So for example, if you think about car manufacture and the example of electric cars, they could be produced more cheaply if you went into an alliance with producers in India, China, or even Eastern Europe. The Tata Nano was a celebrated example of frugal engineering based on completely licensed technology. It had very limited success in the Indian market. In fact, I think the whole Cyrus Mistry affair where he resigned was because he felt this was a loss-making venture which the Tata should have cut down on, but he felt that it was so dear to the heart of the chairman that he wasn't allowed to do that. So it was a limited success in the Indian market and in terms of its own objectives, but it showed a huge untapped demand at low prices, and it set off a kind of race for producing the cheapest car, even in the West. Could there be a similar trajectory for electric cars to cut down the pollution from automobiles? This matters a lot for Europe and also in the developing world where concerns about pollutions have been strong. And here's a little graphic for you to sort of think about. This is the cumulative sales of plug-in electric vehicles in different global markets. And I just want you to notice how low is the installed base in the UK. And I also want you to notice, to put up this ad which came through the email to me from my university, where basically a company called Mahindra is asking students to come and test drive an electric car. And they have done some calculations to show that it would cost them just £10 a month. Now, the success of examples like this also depends on a certain kind of infrastructure provision. I don't know whether we want to call it market failure or we don't, but one of the things that constrains the widespread adoption of electric cars is the availability of charging outlets. I know that there are a couple near my house in Hammersmith, but I also have a neighbor who always finds it hard to find the parking near those spots. So one of the ways, so even though our reply to the green paper is in the spirit of, I don't know, argument 2, which was, I think, Lundwall's point, I think that we still have a sort of a public investment prescription, and this is in terms of building the infrastructure, both in policy as in patent pools, and in investment as in these enabling infrastructures of providing the charging points in order to exploit other complementarities that already exist.